All right, so today we're going to be looking at a topic that might make some people giggle a little bit.
Yeah.
It has to do with vaginal sensitivity.
Okay.
We're doing a deep dive into a Reddit thread,
Okay.
and someone asked, why is the vagina so sensitive to the elements?
Oh, interesting.
Like like the weather and stuff and
Hmm.
different things.
Hmm.
And, sometimes the simplest questions
Right.
can really lead to like the most fascinating discoveries.
It's true. And it's interesting how, different parts of our body have like really specific
Yeah.
needs and sensitivities, and it's all kind of tied to
Yeah,
their, evolutionary function and all that.
exactly. And so the most common explanation that people gave on this Reddit thread was the idea of like,
Okay.
the vagina is like a life factory
Right.
versus the anus is like the exit chute.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some of the Redditors had like pretty colorful ways of putting it.
Oh, I bet.
But
I can imagine.
it really highlights like the different functions of these two parts of the body.
Right. And one person said that, the vagina like has to be habitable for a very specific organism sperm,
Right.
while the anus is more about just like keeping the bacteria out and the waste moving.
Exactly. So like different functions equal like different levels of sensitivity.
Totally.
But you mentioned something earlier about like the microbiome.
Yes.
How does that factor into like the sensitivity of the vagina versus the anus?
Well, both the vagina and the anus have their own unique microbiomes,
Okay.
but the vaginal microbiome is way more sensitive to any kind of disruption
Okay.
because it really needs to maintain this very specific pH level
Gotcha.
to support a potential pregnancy.
Okay, so it's kind of like comparing like a delicate ecosystem to like a not so delicate one.
Yeah, less delicate one.
Right. But thinking about just like the anatomy itself,
Yeah.
are there any like structural differences between the vagina and the anus that might contribute to that sensitivity?
Absolutely. The thread brought up this difference between the vagina, which is internal, and the vulva, which is external.
Right.
And unlike the rectum, the vagina doesn't have that double sphincter for protection.
Oh, so it's just way more exposed,
Way more exposed.
which could be why it's more prone to like irritation.
Exactly. And it kind of ties back into that whole like life factory analogy.
Right.
It needs to be accessible for sperm,
Yeah.
which means that it's also more vulnerable to like external factors.
It's all connecting.
Yeah.
So this deep dive is really starting to shed some light on why the vagina might be a little more sensitive than other areas.
Yeah, this is just the beginning.
Okay.
We're just scratching the surface here.
Now, before we get too much deeper,
Mm-hmm.
I do want to remind everyone that if you're enjoying this exploration
Yes.
of the human body and all of its complexities,
Yeah.
you can find more thought-provoking discussions like this one on our podcast, Voices of the Soul.
That's right. And if you love to learn through visuals, some visual content,
Yes.
you should go check out the Shauna Pelage YouTube channel.
Yes, that's a great point.
Yeah. There's a lot of engaging content there that can complement what we're talking about here.
Perfect. All right, so let's get back to our discussion.
Yep.
We were talking about anatomical differences between the vagina and the anus. What else did this Reddit thread reveal
Okay.
about why the vagina might be so sensitive?
Well, we can't forget about the pelvic floor muscles.
Okay, the pelvic floor muscles play a role.
They do. They do.
How so?
Well, they're kind of like a hammock that supports all your pelvic organs,
Oh, wow.
including the bladder, uterus, and rectum.
Okay, so how do those muscles contribute to the sensitivity?
So strong and flexible pelvic floor muscles can actually enhance your sensation.
Okay.
They contract and they relax, and that actually plays a part in arousal and pleasure.
Interesting. So there's like a direct connection between like muscle strength and sensitivity.
Yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm.
But on the flip side, like weak or tense pelvic floor muscles
Okay.
can actually lead to like decreased sensitivity pain during intercourse
Oh.
and other issues.
So it's important to take care of those muscles.
It is very important.
Huh.
And you can strengthen them with like specific exercises,
Okay.
like Kegels.
Kegels. Yeah, I've heard of those.
Yeah.
Aren't those for bladder control?
They are for bladder control, but they can also have a really positive impact on your sexual well-being.
It's amazing how everything in the body is connected.
It really is.
So now, you did mention that this Reddit thread should not be taken as medical advice.
Of course, always.
Right.
It's important to remember that everybody's body is different.
Right.
And this is really just a starting point for understanding vaginal sensitivity.
Exactly. If anybody has any concerns, it's always best to talk to a doctor.
Absolutely. Your doctor or a qualified healthcare provider.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, this Reddit thread also sparked some conversations about evolution.
Yes.
and how evolution maybe plays a role in vaginal sensitivity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so from an evolutionary perspective, both the vagina and the oral cavities
Hmm.
develop sensitivity because they accept things from the environment.
So is that like a way to detect harmful substances?
Exactly. It's like a brilliant defense mechanism.
Yeah.
The rectum, on the other hand, mainly expels waste, so it doesn't really need that same level of sensitivity.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
Like, our bodies have really evolved these tailored systems for both, like, protection and function.
it's incredible.
It is. Um, but is the vagina's sensitivity just about, like, protection and reproduction?
That is a great question. And while those are key factors, there's definitely more to the story.
Really?
The vagina has a really high density of nerve endings.
Yeah.
And as we discussed before, the pelvic floor muscles also play a role.
So it's not just about creating life, it's also about pleasure and bonding.
Precisely. And one Redditor actually mentioned
Okay.
a really interesting detail that the vaginal walls can actually absorb proteins and hormones from ejaculation.
Oh, wow. That adds a whole new layer to the discussion.
It does. It suggests a much more complex and multifaceted role for vaginal sensitivity that really extends beyond just those purely biological functions.
This is so fascinating. Before we move on,
Yeah.
I want to remind our listeners, if you're enjoying this journey
Yeah.
into the, complexities of the human body, be sure to subscribe to Voices of the Soul.
Yes, and don't forget to check out Shauna Pelage on YouTube for visually engaging deep dives.
Yes, great point. Okay, so back to our exploration. We've talked about anatomy, evolution. We even touched on the microbiome. What other factors might contribute to vaginal sensitivity?
One thing we haven't really explicitly talked about is the role of hormones.
Hormones, yeah.
Yeah.
How do hormones affect things?
So hormones, they can have a huge impact,
Oh, yeah, hormones are like the puppet masters of the body.
They really are, and fluctuations throughout like the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, menopause
Yeah.
can really change the sensitivity levels.
It's not just the physical structure, it's like the internal chemistry, too.
It's all connected. For example, estrogen
Right.
is really important for keeping things lubricated down there and the tissue healthy.
Oh, okay.
And that directly affects the sensitivity. So when estrogen levels drop, like during menopause, a lot of women experience vaginal dryness and decreased sensation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, our bodies are always changing,
Always in flux.
and that affects how we experience everything.
Right, and it kind of brings us to another point, which is that everybody's different.
Yes.
What might feel good to one person might be irritating to another.
Right, and that reminds me of that, like, soap debate we were talking about earlier.
Oh, yeah.
Like, some people use whatever soap,
Yeah.
and they're fine, and other people have, like, reactions.
Right, and it just shows you really have to listen to your own body and figure out what works for you.
Yeah, for sure.
Because what might be perfectly fine for one person could cause like a lot of discomfort for somebody else.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So after all this discussion about vaginal sensitivity,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think is like the main thing
Yeah.
for our listeners to take away?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that vaginal sensitivity, it's not just one thing.
Yeah.
There's so many factors. The anatomy, evolution, hormones,
Right.
individual variation, even cultural norms can play a role. And the Reddit thread that we looked at, just gives you like a tiny glimpse into how complicated it is.
It's a rabbit hole, for sure.
Totally, but there's so much more to learn.
Yeah, we started with this simple question, and it's like, whoa.
Yeah, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion. You just keep finding more and more.
Exactly, and that's what I love about these deep dives.
They
You get to
don't-
challenge our assumptions, look at different viewpoints, and learn so much.
Yeah, it really broadens our understanding of everything.
I couldn't have said it better myself. But before we wrap up, you did mention a final thought you wanted to leave us with.
Oh, yes.
Something about the evolutionary purpose of vaginal sensitivity.
So we talked about how it might have evolved to help us detect harmful things.
Right?
But could there be another reason? Could it be about more than just protection or even reproduction?
Okay.
Could this sensitivity also be important for pleasure and bonding?
Oh, that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, it suggests that, this sensitivity is part of what makes us human.
Right, and it makes us connect with each other.
Exactly, and it just opens up all these new questions and ways of thinking about this biological phenomenon.
And that's what I love. We've reached the end of this deep dive, but it feels like the beginning of so much more.
It is. It's like a launching pad for more exploration and learning.
I love that. And speaking of learning, if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to subscribe to Voices of the Soul for more thought-provoking discussions just like this one.
And for those of you who like visuals, head over to the Shauna Pelage YouTube channel.
Yes, she has such great content over there.
Definitely.
Okay, so that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring.
See you then.
So hormones, how do they really affect things?
Well, hormones, they fluctuate, right? And like throughout your cycle,
Yeah.
pregnancy, menopause, all of those can really impact how sensitive things are.
So it's not just the physical structure, but it's also our chemistry, internally.
It's like everything's connected, like estrogen, for example. It's super important for, keeping things lubricated and the tissues healthy down there,
Oh.
which affects sensitivity.
Right.
So when estrogen drops, like during menopause, a lot of women experience vaginal dryness and less sensation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because it's our bodies are constantly in flux and changing.
Yeah, always changing.
And those changes affect how we experience, the world around us.
And that brings us to another important point, which is that everybody's different.
Right.
What one person might find pleasurable or irritating
Yeah.
might be totally different for someone else.
Right. And that kind of goes back to the whole soap debate that we were talking about before.
Oh, yeah.
From that thread, some people are like, oh, I can use whatever soap.
Yeah.
And other people are like, no, I have to use this specific kind.
Exactly.
So it's really about figuring out what works for you.
It really is. You got to listen to your body.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So after this whole deep dive into vaginal sensitivity, what do you think, the main thing is that listeners should take away?
I think the biggest takeaway is that vaginal sensitivity is complicated.
Right.
It's not just one thing. It's like anatomy evolution hormones.
Yeah.
Your own personal differences and even cultural norms can play a role.
Right.
So the Reddit thread we looked at, it just gives you a little peek into how complex it really is.
Yeah, we started with this simple quotient and it's blossomed into this whole...
It's like an onion. You peel back the layers and you just keep finding more.
Exactly. And that's what I love about these deep dives.
Me too.
It challenges our assumptions.
Uh-huh.
We get different perspectives and we learn a lot.
Yeah, it really broadens our understanding of everything.
I couldn't have said it better myself. But before we wrap up completely, you did mention a final thought.
Oh, yeah.
Something about the evolutionary purpose of vaginal sensitivity.
Right. So we talked about how it might have evolved to help us, detect harmful things.
Yeah.
But could there be another reason, beyond protection or even reproduction? Could this sensitivity also be super important for, pleasure and bonding?
That is a really interesting thought.
Yeah, it makes you think, maybe the sensitivity is a part of what makes us human, you know?
Right. And it allows us to connect with each other.
Exactly. And it just opens up all these new questions and ways of thinking about this biological phenomenon.
I love it. So we've reached the end of this deep dive, but it feels like just the beginning.
It does. It feels like a launching pad for even more learning and exploration.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this incredible deep dive into vaginal sensitivity. I know I learned so much, and I hope our listeners did too.
My pleasure.
And speaking of learning, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to Voices of the Soul for more thought-provoking discussions like this one.
And don't forget about Shauna Pelage on YouTube. She's got really engaging videos that expand on all these topics.
Definitely. All right, so that's it for this episode of Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep exploring.
Bye.